Bob Henderson's weathered hands froze mid-prayer, his wedding ring catching the last rays of desert sunlight as three German shepherds emerged from the storm like shadows sent from heaven itself. The old widower had been touching his ring 3 times, Martha's secret signal for "I love you." When the dogs appeared at Sunset Mesa rest stop, their eyes burning with recognition of something no human had noticed. "Well, I'll be damned," Bob whispered, his voice cracking with 6 months of grief. The lead dog, scarred and battle-worn, sat at perfect military attention. The second, a gentle female, pressed against his trembling legs with maternal protectiveness. The smallest, an albino shepherd, positioned himself like a sentinel between Bob and the approaching storm. Behind them, a van door slammed. Marcus Webb stepped into view, his helpful smile masking predatory intent. "Looks like you could use some help, old man." The dog's hackles rose in unison, a low growl rumbling through the desert air. Bob's heart hammered against his ribs as Martha's ashes scattered in the wind from his shaking hands. Something was terribly wrong, and only the dogs knew what. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Bob Henderson had taught American history for 45 years, but nothing had prepared him for the lesson life was teaching him now. At 68, he sat behind the wheel of his battered 1998 Honda Civic, Martha's urn secured in the passenger seat where she used to sit during their Sunday drives. The cancer had taken her 6 months ago, leaving behind a mountain of medical bills that had swallowed their retirement savings and cost them their home of 30 years. "Find the light again, Bobby," Martha had whispered with her final breath, her fingers tracing his wedding ring 3 times, their secret code for "I love you" that had survived 4 decades of marriage. Now, Bob was driving cross-country to scatter her ashes at Willow Creek, the small Montana town where she'd spent her childhood summers, chasing fireflies and believing in magic. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had dedicated his life to teaching that every soul matters, every story has value, now felt utterly forgotten by the world. His phone hadn't rung in 17 days. The house he'd mortgaged to pay for Martha's treatments was gone, sold to strangers who painted over the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where they'd measured their son Michael's growth. Michael, his only child, a canine handler in Afghanistan who'd earned a Bronze Star before an IED explosion claimed both him and his partner in 2019. Bob kept Michael's final letter in his wallet, creased from countless readings. "Dad, Max is the best partner I could ask for. If anything happens to me, promise you'll take care of him. He's got more loyalty in one paw than most people have in their whole bodies." But the military had told Bob that Max died too. Another lie in a stack of bureaucratic lies that had defined his grief. Now, Bob's diabetes medication rattled in the pill organizer beside Martha's urn, counting down the days like a calendar of surrender. His savings account showed 847,50 cents, enough for gas to Montana, and maybe a week of cheap motels after that. The teaching pension barely covered his heart medication, and the foreclosure had destroyed his credit. At 68, he was too old to rebuild and too tired to fight. The Sunset Mesa rest stop appeared through his windshield like a mirage, its weathered sign promising clean restrooms, cold drinks, safe haven. Bob laughed bitterly at that last part. There was no such thing as a safe haven anymore. Not for men like him who'd become invisible to a society that discarded its elderly like outdated textbooks. He pulled into the parking lot as thunder rumbled overhead, dark clouds gathering with the promise of the storm that had been chasing him across 3 states. Bob stepped out, clutching Martha's urn against his chest, and touched his wedding ring 3 times, once for the love they'd shared, once for the son they'd lost, and once for the loneliness that was eating him alive. That's when he saw them, 3 German shepherds watching him from the edge of the storm. The 3 German shepherds emerged from the gathering storm like something out of a fever dream, their coats matted with rain and dust from miles of desert wandering. Bob Henderson stood frozen beside his Honda, Martha's urn clutched against his chest as the dogs approached with an almost military precision that made his breath catch in his throat. The lead dog was magnificent despite his rough condition, a massive male with a grizzled muzzle and a distinctive scar running over his left eye like an old war wound. His ears stood at perfect attention, and when he looked at Bob, there was an intelligence there that seemed almost human. Behind him, a smaller female with gentle brown eyes moved with the careful grace of a mother who had known loss, her ribs showing beneath her sable coat, but her spirit unbroken. The third dog, an unusual albino shepherd with pink-rimmed eyes, was clearly the youngest, though something in his bearing suggested he'd seen more than his share of hardship. Bob's hands trembled as he set Martha's urn on the hood of his car and reached into his jacket pocket for the half sandwich he'd been saving for dinner. "Well, boys," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "looks like we're all a little lost out here." He broke the sandwich into 3 pieces, placing them on the cracked asphalt. "Martha always said dogs know good people better than good people know themselves." The big male approached first, sniffing the offering before gently taking it. As he did, Bob noticed something that made his heart skip: the dog's movements, the way he sat, the alert positioning of his ears. This wasn't just any stray. This animal had been trained, and trained well. "You were somebody's partner, weren't you, boy?" Bob murmured, extending his hand slowly. The dog sniffed his fingers, then did something that nearly brought Bob to his knees. He sat at perfect attention and lifted his right paw in what could only be described as a salute. Bob's mind reeled back to Michael's letters from Afghanistan, to stories about his canine partner Max, to the military's cold assurance that both his son and the dog had died in that IED explosion. "No," he breathed, studying the dog's scarred face. "It can't be." The storm was building overhead, dark clouds rolling across the desert sky like an advancing army. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind carried the promise of a deluge that would make travel dangerous. Bob glanced around the rest stop, a lonely outpost on Highway 50, the kind of place where travelers stopped reluctantly and left quickly. A few picnic tables, restrooms that had seen better decades, and vending machines that hummed with the struggle of keeping sodas cold in the desert heat. That's when he heard the van door slam. "Excuse me, sir?" The voice was friendly, concerned, with just the right amount of helpful neighbor warmth. "Looks like you might need some assistance." Bob turned to see a man approaching from a gray panel van that had pulled in while he'd been focused on the dogs. The stranger was about 45, average height, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans that suggested a working man. His smile was practiced, the kind Bob had seen on used car salesmen and politicians, but his eyes held something else entirely. A calculating coldness that made Bob's teacher instincts prickle with warning. "My van broke down about a mile back," the man continued, gesturing toward his vehicle. "Engine just died on me. I was wondering if you might have jumper cables, or maybe you could give me a ride to the next town. I'd be happy to pay for gas." The response from the 3 dogs was immediate and unmistakable. The big male rose to his feet with a low growl that seemed to come from the depths of his chest. The female positioned herself between Bob and the stranger, her hackles raised. The albino shepherd circled behind Bob, completing what looked suspiciously like a protective formation. "Easy there, fellas," the stranger said, his smile faltering slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble, just a man in need of help." He looked at Bob with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Are these your dogs? They seem a bit aggressive." Bob found himself studying the stranger more carefully. Something was off. The man claimed his van had broken down a mile back, but Bob had been sitting here for 20 minutes and hadn't seen anyone walking down the highway. The van's engine was still running. He could hear the idle from where he stood, and there was something familiar about the man's face, something that tugged at memories Bob couldn't quite grasp. "They're protective," Bob said carefully, placing a hand on the big male's head. The dog leaned into his touch, never taking his eyes off the stranger. "Been through some hard times, I'd guess." "Haven't we all?" the stranger replied. And now Bob was certain he heard something underneath the friendly tone, a darkness that made his skin crawl. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now. The storm was coming, and Bob realized with growing unease that he might be trapped here with more than just bad weather. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Bob Henderson found himself caught between his ingrained politeness and the growing alarm signals his 3 canine guardians were sending. The stranger's smile had grown increasingly strained as the dogs maintained their protective formation, and Bob's teacher instincts, honed by decades of reading teenage deception, were screaming that something wasn't right. "Look, I don't want to be a bother," the man said, taking a step closer. "But this storm's going to be a real gully washer, and I've got nowhere to shelter. Maybe we could wait it out together in your car?" The big German shepherd, the one Bob was becoming more convinced was somehow connected to his son Michael, let out a warning bark that echoed across the empty rest stop like a gunshot. The sound made the stranger flinch, his helpful mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something predatory underneath. "Aggressive dogs can be dangerous," the stranger continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Especially strays. You never know what diseases they might be carrying, or if they've been trained to attack." That's when it happened. As Bob nervously touched his wedding ring, once, twice, 3 times in the unconscious gesture that had become his prayer to Martha, the scarred German shepherd's ears shot forward with laser focus. The dog's entire body went rigid, and then he did something that made Bob's heart nearly stop beating. The dog sat at perfect attention, lifted his right paw in that unmistakable salute, and then deliberately pawed the ground 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times, the exact pattern Bob had just traced on his wedding ring. "Dear God," Bob whispered, his knees nearly buckling. "You do know. You recognize the signal." Memories flooded back like a broken dam. Michael's letters describing his canine partner's intelligence, the dog's ability to read hand signals, to respond to the subtle communications that kept soldiers alive in hostile territory. The 3-tap signal had been something Bob had taught Michael as a child, their secret family code for "I love you," that Martha had started and they'd all adopted. The stranger was still talking, but Bob was no longer listening. He was staring into the eyes of what he was now certain was his son's partner, the dog the military had told him was dead. "Max," he whispered. The dog's tail wagged once, a controlled wag that spoke of recognition and relief. The female shepherd pressed closer against Bob's legs, and the albino moved to block any potential escape route the stranger might use to get behind them. "Did you just call that dog Max?" the stranger asked, and Bob caught something in his voice, a sharpness that cut through the helpful neighbor act like a blade. "That's an interesting name." "Military, isn't it?" Bob's blood chilled. How would a stranded motorist know that Max was a military name, unless he wasn't really stranded at all? The stranger seemed to realize his mistake because his expression shifted completely. The helpful smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You know, Mr. Henderson, you're not as easy to fool as the others were." "Others?" Bob's voice came out as a croak. 7 others, to be exact, all lonely old men traveling alone, all of them trusting enough to help a stranger in need." The man reached into his jacket and Bob caught a glimpse of something metallic. "All of them forgotten by their families, missed by no one. Max, because Bob was now certain that's who this was, erupted into action. The dog launched himself forward with a snarl that seemed to come from the depths of hell, going directly for the stranger's weapon arm. The female shepherd, moving with the protective instincts of a mother who had lost too much already, positioned herself as a shield between Bob and the threat. The albino, despite being the smallest, showed no fear as he circled to cut off the stranger's retreat to his van. "Get them off me!" the stranger screamed, stumbling backward as Max's jaws clamped down on his wrist. The metallic object, a hunting knife, clattered to the asphalt as the man tried desperately to shake off the determined German shepherd. Bob's mind was reeling, trying to process the transformation from helpful stranger to deadly predator, but his body was moving on pure instinct. He grabbed Martha's urn from the hood of his car and stumbled toward the rest stop building, his heart hammering against his ribs with dangerous irregularity. "You can't run, old man," the stranger shouted over Max's furious barking. "I know everything about you." Robert Henderson, 68 years old, widowed 6 months ago. Son died in Afghanistan, house foreclosed last month. No family, no friends, no one who would even notice if you disappeared. The words hit Bob like physical blows. This man had been stalking him, studying him, learning his vulnerabilities. How long had he been watched? How long had this predator been circling like a vulture, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the surreal scene in stark black and white. The stranger had managed to break free from Max's grip and was running toward his van, blood streaming from his torn wrist. But the dogs weren't giving up. They pursued him with military precision, working as a team to herd him away from any potential weapons. Bob reached the relative safety of the covered picnic area and fumbled for his cell phone with shaking hands. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. They were in the middle of nowhere, exactly where a predator would want his victims to be. The stranger reached his van and spun around, something new in his hand. Not a knife this time, but something worse. Much worse. "That's far enough!" he screamed at the dogs, and Bob's heart stopped as he saw what the man was holding, a gun, and it was pointed directly at Max. "Call them off or I start shooting." The gun gleamed dully in the stormlight as Marcus Webb, because Bob now remembered the name from his class roster 28 years ago, held it with the practiced grip of someone who had used it before. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the rest stop's cracked asphalt into a treacherous maze of puddles and shadows. "I said call them off!" Marcus screamed again, his voice cracking with desperation. Blood dripped from his torn wrist where Max had bitten him, mixing with the rain to create pink rivulets that ran down his arm. Bob's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the helpful stranger with the cold-blooded killer, trying to match this monster with the troubled teenager he'd once tried to save. "Marcus Webb," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the storm. "You were in my American history class, fall semester, 1995. Marcus's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise, or perhaps satisfaction at being remembered. "Very good, Mr. Henderson, though you always were better with names than most teachers." The memory was crystallizing now, painful in its clarity. Marcus had been one of those students who sat in the back corner, quiet and sullen, with angry scars across his left cheek and neck. Bob remembered asking about them once, receiving only a mumbled explanation about a dog attack when Marcus was 7. The boy had been in foster care then, bounced between homes, carrying a rage that seemed to burn just beneath his skin. "I tried to help you," Bob said, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "I recommended counseling. Talked to the school psychologist." "Help?" Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You want to talk about help? You sent me to that shrink who told me I needed to process my trauma. You know what processing trauma got me? More foster homes, more dogs." More scars. The female shepherd, Bob had started thinking of her as Angel, shifted closer to his legs, her warm body a comforting presence against his trembling frame. She was injured, he realized now, favoring her left front paw, but she hadn't abandoned her protective position for a second. Max remained crouched low, muscles coiled for another attack, his scarred face a mask of controlled fury. The albino shepherd had positioned himself near the building's corner, effectively cutting off Marcus's escape route back to the highway. Even outnumbered and outgunned, they weren't giving up. "You remember the others, don't you, Marcus?" Bob asked, buying time as his mind raced for a solution. "Your classmates? Jenny Morrison became a nurse. Tommy Chen owns 3 restaurants now. Sarah Williams teaches kindergarten. They all made something of themselves despite their problems." "Spare me the inspirational speech," Marcus snarled. "You think I don't know what happened to them? Perfect little lives with perfect little families, while I got thrown away like garbage." Lightning illuminated the scene again, and Bob saw something that made his blood freeze. In the bed of Marcus's van, partially covered by a tarp, were suitcases. Lots of them. Different sizes, different colors, the kind elderly travelers carried. 7 others, Bob whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You said 7 others. Marcus followed his gaze and smiled, a horrible expression that transformed his face into something inhuman. "Smart man? Yes. 7 others. Lonely old folks just like you, traveling alone, trusting enough to help a stranger." He gestured toward the suitcases with his free hand. "They don't need their belongings anymore." Bob's legs nearly gave out as the full horror hit him. This wasn't random violence. Marcus had been systematically hunting elderly travelers, probably for months, and Bob had almost walked right into the trap. "Why the elderly?" Bob managed to ask, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Because nobody cares about you," Marcus said with matter-of-fact cruelty. "Nobody reports you missing for days, sometimes weeks. Perfect victims for someone who needs to disappear himself." That's when Bob noticed the news report playing on the van's dashboard radio. Barely audible over the storm, but distinct enough to catch fragments. "Manhunt continues for suspect in Nevada disappearances, considered extremely dangerous. Approach with caution." Marcus was running. This wasn't just about killing for the sake of killing. He was eliminating witnesses, covering his tracks as he fled from something bigger. "The FBI is closing in," Bob said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why you need to disappear. But you can't leave witnesses behind." Very perceptive. A+ for critical thinking. Marcus's grip on the gun tightened. "Though I'm afraid your final exam is going to be rather permanent." That's when Angel made her move. Despite her injured paw, she suddenly broke from Bob's side and charged directly at Marcus, not attacking but creating a distraction. In that split second of confusion, Max launched himself from his crouched position, going low and fast. The gun went off with a deafening crack that echoed across the empty rest stop. Bob screamed, certain that one of his protectors had been shot. But then he saw Marcus staggering backward, his shot going wide. Max had hit him in the legs, bringing him down in a tangle of limbs and fury. The gun skittered across the wet asphalt, spinning to a stop near one of the picnic tables. Bob ran for it, his 68-year-old legs moving faster than they had in years, driven by desperation and the knowledge that this was their only chance. His fingers closed around the weapon just as Marcus broke free from Max's grip and lunged toward him. The 2 men went down in a heap, Bob's arthritis screaming in protest as they grappled for control. Marcus was younger, stronger, driven by the desperate fury of a cornered animal, but Bob had something Marcus didn't. He was fighting for more than just his own life. He was fighting for the 3 loyal souls who had risked everything to protect a stranger. He was fighting for Martha's memory, for Michael's sacrifice, for the idea that love and loyalty still meant something in a world that seemed increasingly dark. You always were weak, Marcus gasped as they struggled. Just like all the others, pathetic old man with nothing left to live for. You're wrong, Bob managed, his voice strained but firm. I've got everything to live for. They gave it to me. As if summoned by his words, Max appeared beside them, his jaws clamping down on Marcus's shoulder with surgical precision. Angel, despite her injury, grabbed Marcus's other arm. The albino shepherd positioned himself to prevent any escape. With the dog's help, Bob was able to pin Marcus down, the gun finally secure in his trembling hands. Marcus looked up at him with eyes full of rage and something that might have been fear. "Go ahead," Marcus spat. "Shoot me. Become just like me." Bob looked down at the man who had been his student, who had become a monster, who had planned to make him victim number 8. His finger tightened on the trigger as he thought about the 7 other families who would never see their loved ones again, about the terror Marcus had spread across the highways. But then Angel whimpered softly beside him, and Bob saw something in her eyes. Not bloodlust or revenge, but the gentle wisdom of a creature who had known suffering but chose love anyway. "No," Bob said quietly, lowering the gun. "That's where you're wrong, Marcus. I won't become you. That's what makes us different." In the distance, sirens were wailing, growing closer with each passing second. Someone had heard the gunshot, or maybe the storm had finally cleared enough for cell signals to get through. Help was coming. Bob sat back on his heels, still holding the gun, but pointing it safely away, and looked at the 3 dogs who had saved his life. Max was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder where Marcus had clawed him. Angel was clearly in pain from her injured paw. The albino shepherd was panting heavily, exhausted from the confrontation. But they were alive. They were all alive. "Thank you," Bob whispered to them, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. The sirens grew louder as Bob Henderson sat in the rain beside 3 German shepherds who had just saved his life, holding a gun on a serial killer who had once been his student. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 45 years of teaching that violence never solved anything, he found himself in a situation where violence had been the only solution. Marcus Webb lay pinned beneath Max's considerable weight, the dog's teeth still gripping his shoulder in a hold that promised instant consequences if he moved. Blood seeped from various wounds on Marcus's arms and legs, mixing with the rain to create crimson streams that ran across the cracked asphalt like accusatory fingers. "They're coming for you," Bob said quietly, watching the red and blue lights approaching through the storm. "FBI, state police, whoever's been tracking you across 3 states. Marcus's laugh was bitter, tinged with the hysteria of a man whose carefully laid plans had been destroyed by 3 strayed dogs. "You think this is over? You think catching me solves anything?" He coughed, specks of blood appearing on his lips. "There are others out there, hundreds of others. Lonely old people dying in rest stops, heart attacks in their cars, accidents on back roads. Who's going to know the difference?" The words hit Bob like physical blows because he knew they contained a grain of terrible truth. How many elderly people disappeared each year without anyone noticing? How many Marcus Webbs were out there, hunting the forgotten and discarded? Angel whimpered softly and pressed against Bob's leg as if sensing his dark thoughts. Her injured paw was clearly causing her pain, but she refused to leave his side. The albino shepherd had positioned himself as a lookout, watching the approaching vehicles with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand help was finally coming. "You want to know the best part?" Marcus continued, his voice growing weaker but no less venomous. "I learned it from you. Remember what you used to say in class? Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Well, I learned that society throws away its weak, just like it threw me away." Bob's hand tightened on the gun as memories flooded back. Marcus, at 14, sitting in the back corner of his classroom with fresh scars on his face and rage in his eyes. The foster care system had failed him, the mental health system had failed him, and ultimately Bob realized with crushing guilt the education system had failed him too. "I should have done more," Bob whispered, more to himself than to Marcus. "I should have seen what you were becoming. Guilt doesn't bring back the dead, teacher." Marcus's eyes were growing glassy with shock and blood loss. "And it won't save the next lonely old man who trusts the wrong stranger." The first police cruiser skidded into the rest stop, followed immediately by an FBI vehicle and an ambulance. Car doors slammed as agents and officers deployed in tactical formation, their weapons drawn and ready. Bob slowly raised his hands, the gun pointing harmlessly skyward. "Robert Henderson," a voice called through a megaphone. "This is Agent Sarah Mitchell, FBI. Are you injured?" "I'm okay," Bob called back, his voice hoarse from the struggle in the storm. "The suspect is down. He's wounded but alive." As the law enforcement officers approached cautiously, Bob found himself studying their faces in the flashing lights. These were professionals who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, yet even they seemed shaken by what they found in Marcus's van. Agent Mitchell, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, emerged from the vehicle's cargo area looking pale. "7 confirmed victims," she announced to her team, her voice carefully controlled. "Personal effects, identification, probably more evidence than we'll need to put him away forever." Bob watched as paramedics worked on Marcus, stabilizing him for transport, while federal agents photographed the scene and collected evidence. The entire rest stop had been transformed into a crime scene, yellow tape fluttering in the storm wind like funeral bunting. "Mr. Henderson?" Agent Mitchell approached him, her expression softening slightly. "I'm going to need you to lower that weapon slowly and step away from the suspect." Bob complied, his hands shaking as he placed the gun on the picnic table. "He was my student," he said quietly. 28 years ago, I taught him American history." Agent Mitchell's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You recognized him?" "Not at first, but when he started talking." Bob's voice trailed off as he watched the paramedics loading Marcus onto a stretcher. "I failed him. As a teacher. As a human being. I saw the warning signs and I didn't do enough." "Mr. Henderson," Agent Mitchell said firmly, "you are not responsible for what he became. We've been tracking him for 6 months. He made his choices, and tonight those choices caught up with him." As they spoke, a veterinarian had arrived to tend to the dogs. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a woman in her 30s with gentle hands and a no-nonsense demeanor, was examining Angel's injured paw while Max submitted to treatment for his shoulder wound. The albino shepherd sat patiently nearby, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. "These are remarkable animals," Dr. Hayes told Bob as she bandaged Angel's paw. "They show signs of advanced training, military or police work, I'd guess. The big male especially. He's got the bearing of a war dog." Bob's heart clenched as he looked at Max, because he was now certain that's who this was. His son's partner, supposedly killed in Afghanistan, somehow alive and somehow here when Bob needed him most. It was too much of a coincidence, too perfect to be anything but a miracle. "Is he going to be okay?" Bob asked, kneeling beside Max and gently stroking the dog's scarred head. "They all are," Dr. Hayes assured him. "Some minor injuries, signs of malnutrition and exposure, but nothing that can't be healed with proper care." She paused, studying Bob's face in the flashing lights. "Do you have somewhere for them to go? Because these dogs clearly consider you family now." Bob looked at the 3 German shepherds who had risked their lives for him, who had seen through Marcus's deception when human intuition had failed, who had given him a reason to fight when he'd been ready to give up on everything. "I guess I do now," he said softly, feeling something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the grief that had held him captive for 6 months, replaced by something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. The storm was beginning to clear, and through the breaking clouds, Bob could see the first faint hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out its liquid song as if welcoming the new day. Bob Henderson was no longer alone. 3 weeks later, Bob Henderson sat in the sterile waiting room of Rocky Mountain Veterinary Hospital, his hands clasped tightly around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the relentless persistence of institutional indifference, while the smell of disinfectant and fear permeated every breath he took. Angel lay somewhere beyond those swinging doors, fighting for her life on an operating table, and Bob felt as helpless as he had when Martha was dying in another hospital, not so different from this one. The parallels were cruel and inescapable, the same vigil, the same prayers to a God who seemed increasingly distant, the same crushing weight of potentially losing someone he'd grown to love. Dr. Jennifer Hayes had delivered the devastating news that morning with the gentle professionalism of someone who'd broken many hearts before. During what should have been a routine examination, she'd discovered something that had been hidden by Angel's thick coat and stoic nature: internal bleeding from the confrontation with Marcus Webb. The injuries were worse than anyone had realized, complicated by what appeared to be older trauma from her life before she'd found Bob. "The damage is extensive," Dr. Hayes had explained, her voice carefully measured. "There's bleeding around her spleen, possible internal ruptures. We can operate, but—" She'd paused, and Bob had seen his own fear reflected in her eyes. At her age, with her condition, the surgery itself could kill her. Max lay at Bob's feet now, his massive head resting on Bob's worn sneakers, as if the dog understood that his pack was incomplete and his human needed comfort. The albino shepherd, Bob had started calling him Duke after his son's favorite baseball player, sat pressed against his other leg, offering silent solidarity in the way that only dogs could provide. Bob's mind kept replaying the past 3 weeks, how quickly he'd fallen into a rhythm with his 3 unexpected guardians. They'd moved into a small rental house outside Denver, nothing fancy but clean and safe, with a fenced yard where the dogs could run. Bob had used the last of his savings and the donations from strangers who'd heard their story on the news, but it had been worth every penny to see the dogs begin to heal. Max had remembered basic commands, responding to Bob's voice with the same military precision he'd once shown Michael. Duke had revealed himself to be a gentle giant despite his fierce appearance during the confrontation, content to lie at Bob's feet while he graded papers. He'd taken a part-time teaching position at a local community college. And Angel, sweet Angel, had appointed herself the pack's emotional anchor, somehow sensing when Bob's grief threatened to overwhelm him and positioning herself close enough to provide comfort. But now Angel was dying, and Bob felt the familiar crushing weight of helplessness that had defined too much of his recent life. He'd lost his son to a war he didn't understand, his wife to a disease he couldn't fight, and his home to bills he couldn't pay. The pattern was becoming unbearable. Everything he loved seemed destined to be taken away. "Mr. Henderson?" A young nurse emerged from the surgical wing, her scrubs bearing cartoon animals that seemed absurdly cheerful in the circumstances. "Dr. Hayes would like to speak with you." Bob's heart hammered against his ribs as he followed her down the hallway, Max and Duke padding silently beside him. The veterinary hospital allowed the dogs to stay, a small mercy in a situation that felt devoid of mercy. "Doctor?" Hayes met them outside the operating room, still wearing surgical scrubs and a mask that hung loose around her neck. Her expression was unreadable, the professional neutrality that medical professionals wore when delivering news that could go either way. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," she began. and Bob felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. We were able to repair the internal bleeding and remove the damaged tissue, but the word hung in the air like a sword. But? Bob's voice came out as a whisper. The next 24 hours are critical. Her body has been through tremendous trauma, both recently and in the past. We've done everything we can surgically, but now it's up to her will to live. Bob sank into a nearby chair, the weight of another vigil settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Can I see her? She's still under anesthesia, but yes. Sometimes they can sense familiar voices even when they're unconscious. The recovery room was dimly lit, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the whisper of oxygen flowing through tubes. Angel lay on a heated pad, looking impossibly small and fragile without her usual alertness. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines, and her breathing was shallow but steady. Bob pulled a chair close to her cage and reached through the bars to gently stroke her head. "Come on, girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved my life. Now let me help save yours." The vigil stretched through the night and into the following morning, with Bob refusing to leave Angel's side despite the nurse's gentle suggestions that he go home and rest. Max and Duke had positioned themselves like sentries outside the recovery room, their presence a comforting constant in the sterile medical environment. Bob dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable chair, waking every few minutes to check Angel's breathing, to whisper words of encouragement, to touch her fur through the cage bars. It was during one of these twilight moments between sleep and consciousness that Dr. Hayes appeared with a manila folder that would change everything Bob thought he knew about his 3 guardian angels. "Mr. Henderson," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. "I ran the microchip scans on all 3 dogs, and I need to share something with you." Her voice carried a weight that made Bob's stomach clench with anticipation. "What is it?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. The past month had contained enough revelations to last a lifetime. Dr. Hayes opened the folder and pulled out a photograph that made Bob's breath catch in his throat. It was a military photo showing a young soldier in desert camouflage, kneeling beside a German shepherd with a distinctive scar over his left eye. The soldier's face was sun-weathered and serious, but his smile was unmistakably warm as he looked at his 4-legged partner. "This is Max," Dr. Hayes said gently, "also known as Military Working Dog M452. And this is his handler, Sergeant Michael Henderson, your son." Bob's hands shook as he took the photograph, studying Michael's young face and the dog who sat beside him with perfect military bearing. "They told me he was dead," Bob whispered. "When Michael died, they said his partner died too." "That's what the official records show," Dr. Hayes agreed. "But sometimes the truth is more complicated than paperwork suggests. Max was severely injured in the same IED explosion that killed your son. He was retired from service with a medical discharge and was supposed to be returned to his handler's family, you, but there was a bureaucratic mix-up. He ended up in a military dog rescue organization instead." The room seemed to spin around Bob as the implications sank in. "He's been alive all this time. For 4 years he's been alive, and I didn't know." Dr. Hayes nodded sympathetically. "The rescue organization has records showing he was adopted by a family in Colorado Springs, but he went missing 6 months ago, right around the time your wife passed away. It's as if he knew you needed him." Bob looked through the recovery room window at Max, who was lying with his head on his paws, never taking his eyes off Angel's unconscious form. The idea that Michael's partner had somehow found his way to Bob in his darkest hour seemed too miraculous to believe, yet the evidence was undeniable. "What about the others?" Bob asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Dr. Hayes turned to another document in the folder. Angel's real name is Bella. She was a registered therapy dog who worked at Denver Children's Hospital until 18 months ago. Her handler was a woman named Martha Henderson. Your wife. The world stopped. Bob stared at the paperwork, seeing Martha's signature on adoption forms, reading reports about Bella's exceptional ability to comfort grieving children. "Martha never told me," he whispered. "She volunteered at the hospital, but she never mentioned." According to the hospital staff, she requested that her therapy dog work specifically with children who'd lost parents. Bella was retired from service after your wife's health declined, and she disappeared from her foster home the day after Martha's funeral. Bob's vision blurred with tears as the pieces of an impossible puzzle fell into place. His wife had worked with Angel, Bella, helping children process their grief, and somehow the dog had found her way to Bob when he needed that same comfort most. "And Duke?" Bob managed to ask, though he wasn't sure he could handle another revelation. "Duke is the most interesting case of all," Dr. Hayes said, pulling out a third set of documents. "His real name is Warrior, and he was part of an experimental program that paired retired military dogs with law enforcement. He was being trained to detect deception and protect vulnerable civilians, specifically elderly people who might be targets for predators." Bob's mind reeled as he processed this information. 3 dogs, each connected to his family in ways that defied coincidence, each trained to provide exactly the kind of help he'd needed at the rest stop. Max, with his military training and loyalty to Michael's family. Angel, with her therapy experience and connection to Martha's compassionate work. Duke, with his specialized training to protect people exactly like Bob from predators, exactly like Marcus Webb. "How is this possible?" Bob whispered. "How did they all find me?" Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents in her lap. "I've been a veterinarian for 15 years, she finally said. "I've seen a lot of things that can't be explained by science or logic. Sometimes I think animals know things we don't. Sometimes I think love transcends death in ways we can't understand." A soft whimper from the recovery room interrupted their conversation. Bob turned to see Angel's eyes fluttering open, unfocused, but aware. Her tail gave a weak wag when she saw Bob's face, and for the first time in 18 hours, he felt hope bloom in his chest. "That's a very good sign," Dr. Hayes said, standing quickly to check Angel's vital signs. "Her responses are strong, and her breathing has improved significantly." Bob pressed his face against the recovery room window, watching as Dr. Hayes examined Angel with gentle, efficient hands. Max and Duke had risen to their feet, their tails wagging as they sensed the change in their pack-mate's condition. "She's going to make it," Bob whispered, and for the first time since Martha's death, he felt the presence of something larger than grief, something that might have been divine intervention, or might have been the simple miracle of love refusing to die. Outside the hospital windows, the Colorado sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Bob of hope itself. 5 years later, Bob Henderson stood in the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows of his small but comfortable home, watching 3 German shepherds, now graying around their muzzles but no less devoted, arrange themselves around the breakfast table like furry disciples waiting for communion. Angel, fully recovered and somehow more beautiful for having survived her brush with death, sat at perfect attention beside his chair. Max, his son's partner and now Bob's constant companion, lay across the doorway in a position that allowed him to monitor both the front yard and his human's every movement. Duke, the gentle giant who'd revealed himself to be the pack's comedian, was attempting to convince Bob through sheer force of will that he deserved a second helping of kibble. Martha always said breakfast was the most important meal of the day, Bob murmured to his canine audience as he buttered his toast, a ritual that had become as essential as breathing. At 73, Bob had learned to mark time not by the relentless march of calendar pages, but by the small ceremonies that gave life meaning. Morning coffee shared with loyal friends, evening walks through the neighborhood where everyone now knew his name, the simple pleasure of being needed. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first year after the rest stop incident had been a careful dance of healing, both physical and emotional, as Bob and his 3 guardians learned to navigate their new life together. The house they'd found was nothing fancy, a modest 2-bedroom rental with a fenced yard and neighbors who understood that sometimes the best family comes on 4 legs. Bob had returned to teaching part-time at Denver Community College, finding unexpected joy in sharing American history with students who reminded him that every generation faced its own challenges and found its own heroes. His story, their story, had spread through social media and local news, inspiring a movement that Bob never could have imagined during his darkest days of grief. The Guardian Angel Project had started small, just Bob and a few volunteers matching rescued dogs with isolated seniors in the Denver area. But word had spread like ripples in a pond, and now the program operated in 47 states, with a waiting list of over 3,000 elderly people who wanted the companionship and protection that only a loyal dog could provide. Every soul matters, every story has value, Bob had told the Congressional Committee when he'd testified about elderly isolation the previous spring. Sometimes the most important stories are told without words, by creatures who love unconditionally and ask for nothing in return except the chance to serve. The financial transformation had been equally miraculous. The GoFundMe campaign, started by strangers who'd heard their story, had raised over $200,000, allowing Bob to pay off Martha's medical debts and purchase the small house where he now sat watching the morning news with his breakfast companions. But more importantly, the donations had funded the Guardian Angel Project's expansion, providing veterinary care, training, and support for hundreds of senior dog partnerships across the country. Bob's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Michael's sister and now Bob's closest friend. "Dad's ready for pickup at 10 a.m. The kids can't wait to see their grandpa and granddogs." The message made Bob smile, remembering how strange it had felt when Sarah had first started calling him Dad, and how natural it seemed now. The connection had been another impossible piece of the puzzle that was Bob's new life. Doctor Mitchell, Sarah, had been the veterinarian who'd saved Angel's life 5 years ago, but she'd also been Michael's sister, carrying her own grief over her brother's death and her own questions about the military's handling of his canine partner. When the truth about Max's identity had emerged, Sarah had reached out tentatively, unsure how to bridge the gap between strangers who shared a profound loss. Now she was the daughter Bob had never had, and her children, Emma, 8, and Lucas, 6, were the grandchildren he'd never expected to claim. They called him Grandpa Bob and treated Max, Angel, and Duke like beloved uncles who could be counted on for games of fetch and patient tolerance of dress-up sessions. Bob looked at the framed photograph on his kitchen counter. Sarah's family at last year's Christmas celebration, with Bob seated in the center like a patriarch, surrounded by children and dogs in a chaos of wrapping paper and unconditional love. Martha's urn sat nearby, no longer a monument to grief, but a reminder of the love that had started it all. The television news was covering another story about elderly isolation, featuring interviews with Guardian Angel Project participants across the country. Bob watched with quiet pride as the camera showed Mrs. Eleanor Watson of Phoenix, Arizona, laughing as her golden retriever partner performed tricks for neighborhood children. The program had grown beyond his wildest dreams, but its heart remained the same simple truth. Nobody should have to face life's challenges alone. A knock at the front door interrupted his reverie, and Bob smiled as he recognized the familiar pattern. 3 short knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. Sarah's children announcing their arrival for their weekly Saturday adventure. Max was already at the door, his tail wagging with the controlled enthusiasm of a military dog who'd learned to express joy within proper protocols. "Grandpa Bob!" Emma's voice carried through the house as she burst through the door, followed closely by Lucas and their patient mother. "Are we still going to the shelter today? I want to see the new puppies." Bob had started volunteering at the county animal shelter 2 years ago, bringing Max, Angel, and Duke to help socialize rescue dogs and demonstrate the power of human-animal bonds. It had become a family tradition, with Sarah's children learning valuable lessons about compassion and responsibility, while helping prepare dogs for their forever homes. "Absolutely," Bob replied, accepting hugs from both children while the dogs performed their own greeting rituals, sniffing, tail wagging, and general celebration of pack expansion. "But first, I have something special to show you." He led them to his small home office, where a large framed certificate hung on the wall beside his teaching awards and family photographs. The Presidential Medal of Freedom nomination, though he hadn't won, had been unexpected recognition for the Guardian Angel Project's impact on American communities. "What's that, Grandpa?" Lucas asked, pointing at the certificate. "That's a reminder that sometimes the most important work we do doesn't feel like work at all," Bob replied, watching as Angel positioned herself between the children and the door, still protective after all these years, still vigilant in her love. As they prepared to leave for the shelter, Bob paused to touch Martha's urn gently. "Thank you for sending them to me, darling," he whispered. "All of them." Outside, the Colorado morning was crisp and full of promise, and Bob Henderson walked toward his car surrounded by the family he'd never expected to have. Human and canine, biological and chosen, proof that love really does find a way. Sometimes life strips everything away, your spouse, your health, your home, your sense of purpose, until you're sitting alone in a rest stop wondering if anyone would even notice if you disappeared. Bob Henderson knows that feeling. At 68, widowed and broke, he was ready to give up when 3 stray German shepherds appeared like angels in the storm. What happened next proves that our darkest moments often precede our greatest blessings. These weren't just any dogs. They were his son's military partner, his wife's therapy dog, and a protector trained to save people exactly like him. Through their loyalty, Bob discovered that family isn't always blood, love doesn't end with death, and second chances can come on 4 paws. Today, his Guardian Angel project has matched thousands of seniors with rescue dogs, creating families from the forgotten and proving that no one has to face their golden years alone. Bob's story reminds us that when we think we're too old to matter, too broken to heal, too forgotten to be found, that's exactly when miracles happen. Sometimes the family we need finds us when we need them most. Have you ever felt invisible or forgotten in your later years? What unexpected blessing has appeared in your darkest moment? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.